In every housing cycle, there comes a moment when the direction quietly shifts, when prices that had been climbing for years begin to soften, sometimes slowly and sometimes with surprising speed, and across the United States, that moment is now visible in several major housing markets, where the balance between buyers and sellers is gradually changing. For most of the early 2020s, the story of American housing was defined by intense demand, record low mortgage rates, and a shortage of homes that pushed prices upward in almost every region. But as interest rates climbed and affordability tightened, the momentum that once fueled those price increases began to weaken in certain cities, where the cost of buying had moved far ahead of what many households could sustain. The result is not a sudden nationwide crash, but something more subtle and historically common: local corrections, where markets that once rose the fastest begin to adjust first. One of the cities where this shift is becoming visible is Austin, Texas, a place that only a few years ago symbolized the explosive growth of the pandemic housing boom. During the period when remote work expanded and technology companies poured into Central Texas, Austin experienced one of the fastest home price increases in the country, with bidding wars becoming routine and inventory shrinking to levels rarely seen in the city's history. Buyers from California, New York, and other expensive coastal markets arrived with larger budgets and often purchased homes above asking price, pushing the median price of a home in Austin to heights that longtime residents found difficult to recognize. But housing markets rarely maintain that kind of acceleration indefinitely. As mortgage rates rose and the supply of newly built homes began to expand around the metropolitan area, the balance slowly shifted. Listings stayed on the market longer, sellers began reducing prices to attract buyers, and the sharp upward curve that had defined Austin's housing story started bending downward. Another city experiencing a similar cooling phase is Phoenix, Arizona, which during the housing boom became one of the most popular destinations for Americans relocating from higher-cost states. The appeal was straightforward: relatively affordable homes, warm weather, and a steady flow of job growth that made the region attractive to both families and investors. For a period of time, Phoenix became one of the fastest-growing housing markets in the country, and prices rose at a pace that outstripped wage growth. Yet the same forces that pushed prices upward eventually created pressure in the opposite direction. As mortgage payments increased with higher interest rates, many potential buyers stepped back, leaving sellers with fewer offers and more competition from other listings. Homes that once sold within days now sometimes remain available for weeks, and price adjustments have become increasingly common across several neighborhoods of the metropolitan area. Moving west along the Pacific coast, the story of price declines becomes visible in San Francisco, a city whose housing market has long been defined by extreme scarcity and high demand. For decades, the technology industry created a constant stream of well-paid buyers willing to compete for limited housing supply, pushing home prices into the highest tier of the American market. However, the changes brought by remote work have altered that dynamic in subtle ways. Some technology workers no longer feel the same need to live within commuting distance of the city's offices, and a portion of the population has gradually relocated to more affordable regions. At the same time, the high cost of borrowing has reduced the number of buyers able to purchase million-dollar homes. These shifts have not erased San Francisco's reputation as one of the most expensive places to live in the United States, but they have created a period where prices are no longer moving upward in the same relentless pattern that defined the previous decade. Further south in California, the housing market of San Diego has also begun showing signs of moderation after years of rapid appreciation. The coastal lifestyle and strong job market have long made San Diego a desirable destination, and the pandemic years intensified that demand as buyers searched for cities that offered both employment opportunities and access to outdoor living. But affordability has become an increasingly powerful constraint. As prices rose, the monthly cost of purchasing a typical home moved beyond what many households could comfortably manage, especially when mortgage rates climbed above the levels that had fueled earlier demand. In response, sellers in certain neighborhoods have begun adjusting their expectations, lowering listing prices or accepting offers below their original targets. These early examples illustrate an important feature of the current housing cycle. Price declines are not appearing everywhere at the same time, but they are emerging most clearly in cities that experienced the fastest growth during the previous boom. In housing history, this pattern has appeared repeatedly. Markets that surge ahead of the national trend often become the first to correct when financial conditions change. As the story of America's housing market continues to unfold, more cities are likely to reveal similar adjustments, each shaped by its own combination of population growth, affordability pressures, and economic shifts that quietly determine where prices rise and where they begin to fall. Beyond the high-profile coastal markets and fast-growing technology hubs, another group of cities is beginning to show similar patterns of softening prices, reflecting how shifts in affordability and demand are influencing housing markets across different regions of the United States. One such city is Boise, Idaho, a place that became one of the most remarkable housing stories during the pandemic years. Boise had long been known as a modestly priced city surrounded by mountains and open landscapes, attracting residents who valued outdoor recreation and a slower pace of life. When remote work expanded and many Americans began searching for less crowded and more affordable communities, Boise suddenly found itself at the center of national attention. Buyers arrived from California and other high-cost states, often bringing larger budgets that transformed the local housing market almost overnight. Homes that once sold at prices typical for a mid-sized Western city began attracting offers that pushed values dramatically higher, creating a rapid escalation that surprised even longtime real estate professionals in the region. But housing booms built on migration and affordability often face limits once prices rise far enough to change the city's original appeal. As Boise's home values climbed, the advantage it once held compared with larger Western markets began to narrow. At the same time, higher mortgage rates increased the monthly cost of buying, making it more difficult for newcomers and local residents alike to enter the market. The result has been a gradual shift, where listings are staying active longer and sellers sometimes adjust prices to meet the new conditions. The pace of the decline is not dramatic, yet it marks a clear transition from the extraordinary surge that defined Boise only a few years earlier. Las Vegas, Nevada, offers another example of a housing market entering a more restrained phase. Historically, Las Vegas has experienced some of the most pronounced cycles in American real estate, rising rapidly during periods of economic growth and cooling quickly when financial conditions tighten. During the pandemic housing boom, the city again became a magnet for buyers relocating from California and other Western states, attracted by Nevada's lower taxes and comparatively affordable housing. New developments spread across the desert edges of the metropolitan area as builders attempted to keep up with demand. Yet when borrowing costs increased, the same market that had once been driven by urgency began to slow. Buyers became more cautious, investors reduced their purchases, and the supply of homes available for sale gradually expanded. In this environment, price reductions have become more common as sellers adjust to a market where buyers now hold greater negotiating power. A similar story can be observed in Denver, Colorado, a city whose strong economy and mountain setting turned it into one of the most desirable housing markets in the western United States during the previous decade. Technology firms, energy companies, and a growing population helped drive demand for housing, while limited land near the city center kept supply relatively tight. These conditions produced years of steady price increases, transforming Denver from a relatively affordable western city into a market where homeownership became increasingly expensive. However, as mortgage rates rose and the cost of purchasing climbed higher, the number of buyers capable of entering the market began to shrink. Homes that might once have attracted multiple offers now sometimes require price adjustments before a sale occurs, illustrating how even strong economies cannot completely shield housing markets from broader financial pressures. The pattern continues in Salt Lake City, Utah, another metropolitan area that experienced rapid growth during the housing boom years. Salt Lake City benefited from a combination of technology investment, population inflows, and a reputation for outdoor quality of life that attracted younger professionals. As demand increased, home prices rose at a pace that eventually began to challenge affordability even for local workers. When mortgage rates increased, the cost of financing those higher prices became a significant barrier. Some buyers paused their plans, while others looked for homes farther from the city center where prices remained lower. Sellers, facing a smaller pool of potential buyers, sometimes responded by adjusting listing prices, producing the early stages of a market correction that reflects the broader national environment. These cities illustrate how the current housing cycle is not defined by a single dramatic event, but by a gradual rebalancing between buyers and sellers. Each market carries its own history and economic foundation, yet the underlying mechanism remains similar. When borrowing becomes more expensive and prices have already climbed to elevated levels, demand often slows. As that demand weakens, sellers begin adjusting expectations, and prices that once moved steadily upward begin to level off or decline slightly. The process can unfold slowly, almost quietly, but over time it reshapes the housing landscape in ways that become increasingly visible across multiple regions of the country. While many of the cities experiencing price declines are located in the western United States, the shift is not limited to that region alone, and several major markets in other parts of the country are beginning to show similar patterns as affordability pressures reshape buyer behavior. One of the most closely watched examples is Seattle, Washington, a city that spent more than a decade as one of the fastest-growing technology centers in the United States. Companies such as Amazon and Microsoft attracted thousands of well-paid workers, and the influx of talent produced an extraordinary surge in housing demand. During the years when mortgage rates were low and employment opportunities were expanding, buyers competed aggressively for homes, often driving prices far beyond their original listing values. Neighborhoods that once felt moderately priced quickly transformed into some of the most expensive areas in the Pacific Northwest. However, housing markets tied closely to the technology sector can shift when economic expectations change. As borrowing costs increased and some technology firms slowed hiring or reduced their workforce, the intensity of demand that once defined Seattle's market began to soften. Buyers became more cautious, particularly when faced with mortgage payments that had grown significantly larger than they would have been only a few years earlier. In response, sellers in several parts of the metropolitan area have begun adjusting prices to meet the new environment. The changes are not uniform across the city, but they represent a noticeable transition from the relentless growth that characterized Seattle's housing story throughout the previous decade. Further south along the Pacific coast, the Los Angeles housing market is also experiencing a period of moderation after years of continuous price increases. Los Angeles has long stood as one of the most complex housing markets in the United States, shaped by a combination of limited land, strict development rules, and a population large enough to sustain constant demand. For decades, these factors created an environment where home prices moved steadily upward, even when national markets slowed. Yet affordability constraints eventually influence even the most resilient cities. As mortgage rates climbed and the cost of purchasing a home rose into the range of several $1,000s per month for many households, the number of potential buyers capable of entering the market began to decline. In practical terms, that change means some homes now remain on the market longer than they once did, and sellers occasionally reduce their asking prices in order to attract interest. The reductions are often modest relative to the city's overall price level, but they signal a shift in momentum. When markets transition from rapid growth to slower conditions, the first signs typically appear in longer listing times and gradual price adjustments rather than dramatic collapses. Over time, however, those small changes can reshape expectations among both buyers and sellers. Another example appears in Portland, Oregon, a city that attracted significant attention during the early years of the housing boom. Portland's appeal combined urban culture with proximity to forests, mountains, and the Pacific coast, making it attractive to younger professionals seeking both employment opportunities and a high quality of life. Migration from California and other western states pushed housing demand sharply upward, and for several years prices rose at a pace that transformed Portland into one of the most competitive housing markets in the region. But as affordability tightened and mortgage rates increased, the dynamic began to shift. Buyers who once might have stretched their budgets became more cautious, and some chose to wait rather than commit to higher monthly payments. With fewer aggressive offers arriving, sellers in parts of the Portland area have started adjusting their prices, creating a pattern that reflects broader national conditions. Like many cities experiencing a similar transition, Portland is not witnessing a sudden collapse, but rather a steady recalibration where the expectations formed during the boom years gradually adapt to a new financial reality. Taken together, the experiences of Seattle, Los Angeles, and Portland demonstrate how housing markets often move in cycles shaped by economic forces that operate far beyond the boundaries of any single city. Interest rates, employment trends, and migration patterns all influence the balance between buyers and sellers. When those forces change, the markets that once rose the fastest can become the first to slow. The resulting price declines may appear modest at first, but they mark an important turning point in the broader narrative of American housing. As the housing market continues adjusting to higher borrowing costs and changing patterns of demand, the final cities on the list reveal how widespread these subtle price shifts have become across the United States. One of the most notable examples is Sacramento, California, a city that for years benefited from its position within commuting distance of the San Francisco Bay Area. During the height of the housing boom, many buyers priced out of the Bay Area began looking inland for more affordable options, and Sacramento quickly emerged as one of the most attractive alternatives. The city offered lower home prices, a growing economy, and the possibility of remote or hybrid work that reduced the need for daily travel into coastal offices. Demand surged, bidding wars became common, and the median home price rose far faster than local wages had historically supported. Yet as mortgage rates climbed and the overall cost of purchasing increased, the factors that once fueled Sacramento's rapid growth began to lose some of their intensity. Buyers who might previously have stretched their budgets became more cautious, while some sellers discovered that the extraordinary price increases of the boom years had reached a point where fewer households could afford them. In response, price reductions began appearing across certain listings, signaling a gradual shift toward a more balanced market. A similar pattern is visible in Tampa, Florida, a city that experienced dramatic population growth during the pandemic migration wave. Florida's reputation for warm weather, relatively low taxes, and expanding job opportunities attracted thousands of new residents from northern states. Tampa, in particular, became a focal point of that movement, with buyers arriving in large numbers and quickly absorbing available housing supply. Prices climbed rapidly as demand outpaced the number of homes on the market, but housing cycles tend to follow familiar rhythms, and when mortgage rates rose, the cost of financing those higher prices increased sharply. Some buyers postponed their plans, while others searched for homes in less expensive areas farther from the city center. Sellers, encountering a smaller pool of potential buyers, sometimes lowered their asking prices in order to complete a sale. The final city often mentioned in discussions of softening housing markets is Nashville, Tennessee, a place that over the past decade has transformed into one of the fastest-growing metropolitan areas in the American South. Nashville's music industry, expanding healthcare sector, and reputation as a cultural center attracted a steady flow of new residents long before the pandemic housing boom began. When that boom accelerated migration into southern states, Nashville's housing market responded with some of the strongest price growth in the region. Construction expanded rapidly, new neighborhoods appeared on the outskirts of the city, and home values climbed at a pace that surprised many observers. But even dynamic cities eventually encounter the limits of affordability. As mortgage rates increased and the cost of buying rose, The intense competition that once defined Nashville's housing market began to soften. Homes that might have sold immediately during the peak years sometimes now require price adjustments before attracting serious offers. The change does not erase the city's long-term growth prospects, yet it demonstrates how quickly conditions can evolve when financial circumstances shift. Taken together, the experiences of these 10 cities, Austin, Phoenix, San Francisco, San Diego, Boise, Las Vegas, Denver, Seattle, Sacramento, Tampa, and Nashville, illustrate a broader transition unfolding within the American housing market. The price declines appearing in these locations are not identical in scale or cause, but they share a common origin in the changing balance between affordability and demand. During the years when mortgage rates were low and migration patterns intensified competition, prices rose with remarkable speed. Now, with borrowing costs higher and buyers more cautious, some of those markets are gradually adjusting. History shows that housing cycles rarely move in straight lines. Periods of rapid growth are often followed by phases of stabilization or modest decline, especially in cities where prices climbed the fastest. The current moment appears to be one of those transitions, where the extraordinary momentum of the early 2020s is giving way to a more measured and uncertain environment. For buyers, sellers, and observers alike, these shifts serve as a reminder that housing markets are shaped not only by local conditions, but also by broader economic forces that influence the ability and willingness of people to purchase homes.